Why should you learn Wohlfahrt's Etude number 31 from book number 2? Well, like with many etudes, there are actually multiple reasons why you should practice and study this etude. Hello fellow instrumentalists, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Jacques Gadway, and this is Gadway Violin. In today's video, we're going to dive into Etude number 31 by Wohlfahrt from his book number 2. Specifically, we're going to talk about why you should learn this etude, what purpose it serves, and what you should hope to gain from practicing it. If you're a subscriber to this channel, you probably already know that I'm a big advocate of learning technique and reinforcing technique through scales and etudes, rather than trying to learn them and reinforce them in repertoire. I believe that when learning repertoire, we should be using techniques that we've already learned and honed in order to bring across the musicality. Scales and etudes, on the other hand, are extremely useful, and they've basically been composed and created exclusively for us to benefit from. There are 5 major etude composers, probably more than that, but 5 that I really like to work with: Sevcek, Wohlfahrt, Kreutzer, Don't, and Rode. And across all of them, they've composed etude books with tons and tons of etudes. This book number 2 from Wohlfahrt, for example, contains 30 etudes. It's easy to purchase an etude book, open it up, and get overwhelmed, and just simply not know what etude or why you should be practicing any of it. In fact, I remember when I was in high school studying with my teacher, I purchased several of these etude books, and over the course of my high school practice, I probably only played 3 etudes out of the Kreutzer book. And honestly, I only really did them because they were required for Allstate. But going further in my violin career, eventually leaving college and becoming a full-time professional violinist, I've come to truly love etudes and scales. This is because when you get out into the real world as a professional violinist, you no longer have a teacher. And so repertoire, music, and especially etudes become your teacher. Maybe once a month, I'll have a day where I go through an entire etude book, just reading it cover to cover. And the purpose of this is not to get better at my instrument, but really it's a kind of investigative practice where I go through each etude and try to understand what the purpose of the etude is, so that I can then refer to it in the future when I want to reinforce that primary objective. You see, with etudes, there's almost always going to be one primary focus to the etude. But alongside that, there's often going to be many supplemental focuses that you can gain from that etude. This etude that we're looking at today, number 31 from Wohlfahrt's book number 2, is a great example of this. The entire etude is comprised of a stream of non-stop eighth notes. On top of that, the suggested fingering is to start in 3rd position and to remain in 3rd position for the entirety of the etude. The tempo marking for the etude is written as moderato, so the etude should not go very fast, unlike what I did in the beginning of the video where I played it quite fast. With all of this information, I can now make a judgment as to what the primary focus of this etude likely is. And therefore, in the future, or right now, I can go through the etude and benefit from practicing it with that primary focus in mind. So with the description of the etude and looking at the beginning of it, we can see that we start in 3rd position and we play a stream of non-stop eighth notes in a moderato tempo. It may already be obvious to you, but in my opinion, the primary focus of this etude is to reinforce good intonation in 3rd position across the strings. One of the techniques that is highlighted in this etude is the idea that when we go from string to string, in any position, but in this case 3rd position, we actually need to make slight adjustments in the way that we're holding the instrument with our left hand in order to accommodate the new string level. One concept that's really important to understand at this level of violin playing is that when you cross from one string to another, it's not just important that we understand how the string crossing operates in the bow arm. It's also important that we understand how the string crossing operates in the left hand. Let's take a look at this angle. If you're playing this etude, you're probably intermediate or advanced, and therefore you know that you should be holding your violin in a specific way. The way that I like to hold the violin is with something that Galamian coined as double contact. This double contact is where we hold the violin with 2 points of contact, never 1 and never 3. While there are exceptions to this, we're going to take a look at it now. The general basis of this is that we have 1 point of contact being our thumb touching the fingerboard, and another point of contact being our index joint touching the fingerboard. Well, not quite the fingerboard, but the neck. In order to do this double contact correctly, it's important to realize that there's going to actually be a gap in between those fingers. We're not going to actually allow the neck to fall into that hole. But that's not the end of double contact. You see, the point that we make contact with the violin on our index finger is going to be specific to what string we're playing. If we're playing on the G string, for example, we need to raise that contact point, or actually, I think lower that contact point is probably the better way to say it. In other words, we need to raise our hand in order to give us more clearance to reach over to the G string. On the contrary, when we go to the E string and we play on these higher strings, we actually need to raise that contact point, in other words, lower the hand in order to make the fingers shorter relative to the instrument. On the thumb side, when we play on the G string, our thumb is going to need to lower. In other words, the contact of the thumb is going to need to raise higher relative to the thumb. This is going to allow our hand to move over. And then when we play on the E string, our thumb is going to need to raise, allowing our hand to move over in the other direction. If we get something thin like a pencil, we can more easily demonstrate this so that you don't have the peg box in the way. But essentially, when we hold the violin, we're going to have a thicker thing in between our fingers, but it's the same idea. When we play on the G string, they're going to rotate. When we play on the E string, they're going to rotate this way. Because we play a constant stream of eighth notes in this etude without shifting, it really emphasizes within third position how the double contact should be shifting in order to accommodate each string. So it's quite subtle, the movements that happen in the hand, but they're absolutely necessary in order to maintain a good intonation. So when practicing this etude, that should be your primary focus. It should be going through the etude at a tempo that you're able to focus on establishing these good habits. But remember that the motions are going to be very subtle. And sometimes, rather than thinking about the actual motions or that movement in the double contact, it's more useful to just think about how comfortable your fingers feel. Do your fingers feel like they have the right amount of length? You might think of it like, do your fingers have the right amount of slack? Or do your fingers have too much slack? Imagine you're on the E string and your hand is way up high. Your fingers might have too much slack. They might be too long for the E string, and they might feel like they're going way up high and then coming way down low and ending up in a shape that's not super comfortable. Once you've played through this etude enough and you get comfortable with the notes as well as the primary focus, you can start to benefit from some of the supplemental focuses. In its base level, without making any changes to the etude at all, it's clearly calling us to play with a good détaché stroke. Amongst the détaché stroke, there should be 3 primary focuses. We should be focusing on consistency of articulation, consistency of tone and volume, as well as consistency of rhythm. Let's take a look at the beginning of the etude again, with these in mind. Were my down bows and up bows even? I think mostly, but they can be better. So one focus might be to make sure that your up bows are not only the same length as your down bows, but also that the articulation at the starts of them sound even. I think in general, the tendency for violinists is to have a slightly more accented down bow than up bow. Without changing the etude, we can simply shift our focus to this idea and try to make it even more even. Another step we can take to help us identify this evenness is to simply reverse the bowing. Let's take the beginning again and start up bow. As you can see, even I have a little bit of unevenness, perhaps in the rhythm and perhaps in the articulation as well. So through practicing this, I can create some more evenness. So far we've taken this etude, and without changing it at all, we've identified and benefited from a primary focus and some supplemental focuses as well. But as creative and persistent practitioners of violin, we can actually find other ways to further intensify the benefits in some of the supplemental fields. One of the primary ways that we do this is by changing the bowing in more ways. So far we've just changed the bowing from starting down bow to starting up bow. However, we've retained the actual articulation. But what if we change the articulation? Let's take the same section again, and let's change the bowing from a regular détaché to a more martelé stroke. In order to accomplish this, we're going to imagine that there's essentially an accent over every single note. This is going to help us solidify our coordination, as well as help us build up a good articulation for this martelé. One of the focuses when practicing this way should be in how our hand is accomplishing the stroke. I like to think of it like my first finger and thumb are pinching the string at the start of each stroke. Together they work in counterbalance in order to push the bow down into the string with a little bit of extra force. In other words, I'm trying not to generate that sound and articulation from the arm, but rather just from that hand pinching the string. If that idea is a little bit confusing, well, then you should probably practice this next method, which is to take the entire thing and play it with a staccato stroke. This is where we're going to actually separate the bow into even parts, and we're going to play with consecutive down bows and consecutive up bows, always stopping the bow in between to re-grip the string. Let's take the beginning again with this new staccato stroke. If you're trying out this etude, most likely this stroke is not new to you. If it is new to you, well then, you should probably learn it. One of the first exercises I like to teach alongside this stroke is the colay movement. You're going to need it for this staccato stroke. I've made videos on this idea in the past. You can check them out in the link below. Either way, we'll go over it quickly now. In the staccato stroke, we're going to separate the bow into 4 even quarters. So we're going to start at the very base, the true frog of the bow, and we're going to make sure that in between every single one of our strokes, we're going to fully stop the bow and actually grip the string. So we're going to put pressure into the string to grip it, so much so that even if you put a little bit of horizontal force, the bow won't actually move, but rather the string itself will move. If you get a little bit of this sound, you're doing something right. The way we create this staccato stroke is by sinking into the string, creating that tension, and releasing it extremely quickly. And if you're wondering why we have to do this colay motion in preparation, it's because we use that exact motion in order to help facilitate this staccato stroke. During each of these stops, where we're actually putting pressure on the string and generating a little bit of potential energy, we're going to find ourselves in one of the extremes of that colay stroke. During those down bow stops, we're going to find ourselves in this flexed position, using our fingers like compressed springs. When we release, we're going to release into that more freed position. On the up bows, it's going to simply be the opposite. We're going to start from that natural position where our fingers are a little bit more stretched, and then we're going to shoot those fingers out of the tension into a flex position. The important thing to remember with the staccato stroke is that we're not adding pressure to create the stroke. We're releasing pressure to create the stroke. In other words, we add pressure in between strokes during the pause. Finally, going back to some of the left-hand ideas, dealing with coordination and rhythm, we're going to look at some additional alternative bowings. We're going to look at slurs. The first variation that I would do is to slur 4 notes at a time. Then I would get a little faster, and then eventually do 8 notes per bow. Whatever slurring option you decide to use, or whatever is appealing to you in your stage of practice, It's important to, before you play, decide how much bow you want to use and make sure that whatever the middle of your slur is ends up being in the middle of that agreed upon bowing. Let's put that into a quick example so it makes a little more sense. So let's take what I just did, the beginning with 8 notes in a bow. I'm going to decide before I play that I want to use the entire bow for this exercise. That means that when I play the 5th note, the halfway point in the measure, I want to be exactly halfway through my bow. Most likely, it'll take a few tries to get to the point where you're actually orienting in that way. However, regardless, when you're practicing slurs, be careful of accenting these goal points. So like I said, I wanted to aim for the halfway point of my bow during the halfway point of the measure. However, I have to be careful not to accent that point. So listen out for this sound and make sure that you don't do it. So we try not to accent our bow change, and we try not to accent the middle of the bow either. The final slur combination that I like to use is the offset pairs. This is where we slur the 2nd note to the 3rd note, the 4th note to the 5th note, the 6th note to the 7th note, and the 8th note to the 1st note of the next measure, and so forth. Let's take a look at an example of this. Both this version of slur practice as well as the other are aimed at one specific idea, the coordination of the left hand and the right. The slurs that are more plain, where we slur 8 notes in a measure, are meant mainly to focus on consistent rhythmic changes of the left hand, whereas the slur where we're offsetting by a note for our pairs is more about coordinating the left hand consistent rhythm with the right hand changes. This additional complication in practicing this etude will create a ton of intuition, which is all we can hope for when we're practicing etudes, scales, and then eventually repertoire. I hope this video has convinced you to pick up a Wohlfahrt book, well, book number 2 specifically, and to practice his etude number 31. I'm going to make plenty of these videos moving forward, going into specific etudes from different etude composers and explaining why we should be learning each of these etudes. If that at all sounds interesting to you, you can let me know in the comments, and or you can subscribe and like this video. That will make sure that you don't miss a future video. If there's an etude that you're struggling with as well, please go ahead and leave that in the comments below so perhaps I can take a look at it in the future. Once again, thank you so much for watching and happy practicing.